Princeton, Illinois. A small community in the Corn Belt in the States, about 120 miles west of Chicago.
Because we live here. Why not? We have wonderful weather. Look at the cloudy blue skies and the sun's out.
The wind whistling through our hair.
Yeah.
We went to the one in Barrie, Canada, and we enjoyed it. And Peter asked for volunteers to maybe put on another one somewhere in the United States. And we waited about 7 months and no one volunteered, so we thought we'd give it a try.
Crazy in it.
Yes.
The rest is history.
He was mixing his record and he was
Smart choice.
in fact, I think if you spoke to him today, you would not see a good word to say. So sorry, Gus, you know, there it is.
How about these? We're going to have an auction in about another half an hour. These are Andy Partridge's boots, signed on the outside here, so that if you wear your pants a little bit short, you can see as you walk along. Although I don't know if anybody's going to wear them or not.
What size?
I don't know what size they are. They're going to be auction. Actually, it's got a couple of. There's a Swindon Stone lights in here. They're going to be auctioned off. Proceeds going to the World Wildlife Fund, along with some other items. The famous Oranges and Lemons guitar.
We were considering it, but I don't think
Me and June are kind of custodians of. We take it to conventions. A lot of people have the photograph taken in the same manner that Andy had his picture taken.
Just love everything about the band, always have.
What is it? What is that indefinable thing that you like about the band?
Great songwriting. Andy's really good at making sure that other unofficial releases get out to the fans. It makes it kind of fun to collect their music.
Right.
Pretty much everything about it. You can't say too much negative as far as the overall XTC experience goes, I would have to say. That's why I have an insane amount of records of theirs in my collection, and plan to keep on collecting.
I've been a big fan of the band since Big Express first came out. I guess you could say All You Pretty Girls changed my life. There was something about it. And it's pretty much been my favorite band ever since.
What is it that you both like about the band?
I like their psychedelic influences a lot. I got into them skylarking. I think it was skylarking and then Orange and Lemons, and it just reminded me a lot of the psychedelic and folk music that I had been brought up on. So.
What sort of the seeds and?
Yeah, the birds.
Right.
Yeah. Iron Butterfly, maybe a little bit.
I like the band because I don't know. For some reason, I seem to like English music more than I do American music, and they just seem to be so English.
Well,
I don't really know how to explain it, but the first group that I ever really liked was the Beatles, and they seem to if the Beatles were still together now, they would probably sound like XTC, I think.
right.
I mean, there's the influences are pretty close. So
I like the band because, as far as I'm concerned, they continue to write and have been writing some of the best songs that have ever been written in, the modern pop era. There's no question about it. I'm always absolutely staggered by their ideas and everything. And I've been listening to them right since Making Plans for Nigel, which was the first one I heard when it came out in Canada.
We've loved XTC now for about, how long? 3 or 4 years? I think the story begins, I heard Dear God on radio on WDRE, and I thought it was this girl and this guy just singing acoustic folk songs. I really liked Dear God, it just really struck a chord with me. And so I watched Skylarking, and I thought it was really cool, but I wasn't totally into them at the time. And then I lent it to this man over here, and that just did it for me. He realized how incredible, the CD.
I remember it was one summer night. I was like playing it around 11 o'clock in the evening, and I was just blown away by it. Yeah, it was the most incredible album since like, I don't know, since Sgt. Pepper or something.
It's Beatlesque. I suppose everybody says that about it, but it is Beatlesque. I think that's one reason it's so great.
It totally drew me in, and then eventually I bought all of them. And yeah, and now I'm an XTC-aholic.
We thought we were fans, so we met some good people here. What else can we say about XTC? They're an incredible group. I say the Beatles are first, and right below is XTC. And I don't think there's anything wrong with calling them quirky, because I think that's why they're so great, because they're quirky. I don't see why that's an insult. It doesn't pigeonhole you into any type of music. Because they've done slow ballads, they've done rock. It's always quirky. I think that's their personality. I think that's what comes through, which the fans like. So I don't think quirky is a bad label at all.
And I love their music, but I also think, a lot like that screen over there, they got a lot of great moves like this. Which is mainly why I like the band, but I think they've got some good melodies and lots of great, incredible chord progressions, so that's probably the reason I like them.
The initial thing that drew my attention to them was the underlying music, the broad-based aspect of the music. They covered so much ground. Being a frustrated musician myself, there was a lot to draw my attention to. They jazz, the rock bit, the odd rhythms, all that. Then the writing on top of that was just icing. And it's been a great ride ever since. Drums and Wires is when I jumped on.
I've been a fan of XTC since about 1970, late 70s, 79, 80. Been looking to see them twice in the past, down in Bath and at Sheffield, and I've been, like I say, I've been a big fan of the band, and over the years I've been able to write to many people worldwide, and the reason for coming to conventions like this is to meet more people and have a good time, and I think XTC are great. Well, they're so different, you know, they're so out of the ordinary, they're not in the stream of all the other bands. They like to do their own thing and go their own way. They're just not commercialised, and they get to do a little bit of their own thing, you know what I mean?
That's why I like XTC, is they're different than everyone else. They're variety, you know, they can do every style and still sound like XTC.
Dix here, half member of the Little Express, XTC's official newsletter, along with my wife Jim. We've been doing it now for an unbelievable 11 years, I think, 36 issues. Have a look at our newsletters here. This is some of the samples of the 36 issues we've done. There's a few more there. Andy in his home studio, which we took a photograph of 2 years ago, the famous Sargent Almonds photograph. Dave with his touring guitar case that he had with him when he came to Toronto to do a gig. That's them leaving the studios in Toronto where they played a live section, walking down Yonge Street. Kind of a unique photograph as they walk away from us.
There may be no golden fleece, but you've been rich as I really. Oh, my head is spinning like the woman who's filled with peace. I see. Let me put my back down and I'll say what all the I'm the scarlet woman who would pick up a punch and make her green. I'm the two-faced man who made an opium brain with things like when all I travel, from the moon to the gravel, as the nets unravel, all exotic fish I find are taste Lions pull me up in myself. Before I travel from the bone to the gravel, after that some alcoholics, hot to fish up on my Jason and the heart. Don't know. She's on the face, my Jason and the heart. Don't know. Human riches are relief. I have watched the man impose so far. Find him, find night. I have watched the man impose find night, find him, other people's lives.
Dave Gregory, Andy Partridge, Colin Moulding, to show our appreciation and to thank you for all the great music and memories you have helped create through the years presented at the XTC Music and Friends Convention 93 today here. So, on behalf of everybody here, Andy, where is he?
They're going that way.
Hopefully we'll see a picture of these at Little Express at their homes and we can all drool over it.
Andy Partridge wore these boots. Not Keith Partridge, Andy Partridge. 260, right here. Going once. Going twice. 261. We got 280 right here. I feel like Jimmy Swaggart up here, you know? He bought them for 280. All right, we need your shoe so we can sell it. Andy Partridge stepped on his shoe.
There were just so many stories that if I would sit down with Andy and have an afternoon of talking to him, he would talk non-stop. And he was brilliant at telling stories. Well, you know, my biggest problem was actually selecting the ones that I thought were really important and keeping the others aside. But you know, 90% of what he told me I couldn't use just because there was so much of it, and it was all really good.
Were they all pleased with the book?
I think so. Well, originally, Andy said he wanted... Well, when it was originally touted that I would do a book, Andy said he would like something that looked like Shout. Do you know what Shout? You know Shout, the Beatles book? By Neil Norman, I think. No, Phil Norman, that's it. Which everyone laughed at, because it's like a Bible. And there's no way that anyone would publish something like that on XTC. You know, the politics of getting a book published would make a story in itself, but what happened was originally they wanted to do something, the publishers that had lots of pictures and very little text, and so I had to battle between Andy's ego and the publisher's budget, which wasn't very big, and eventually we agreed on a book of 60,000 words. So I was very restricted on budget, and it was all done on a shoestring. So when it was finally published, I think they grudgingly thought it was okay. People often say, why do XTC work with a producer when Andy so patently doesn't want to work with a producer? And the reason is very simple, that Colin and Dave won't go into a studio without the producer, because they know that if they did, Andy would walk all over them. And he would too. So when Colin, for instance, records a song, Andy's actually banned from being in the studio, except for playing his parts, and that's true. I didn't put that in the book. Yet his impression of Lennon is the better of the two, when he does that. Yeah. Well, that was off Go too, so that was written in about 4 weeks, and I don't think anybody knew what any of those songs were about, because they were all written on the road, and they had like 2 minutes to write each one. And that's the one that Andy thinks is the least good of all their albums, so he probably doesn't even remember it. If you asked him, he probably wouldn't know. Probably Steve Lillywhite and Hugh Padgham, because they did actually try to get both of them on the last album, and they got very mucked around by both of them. So yeah, no, I'd say both of them, because they still have a lot of respect for both. And John Leckie, well, I know Andy thinks John Leckie's great as a person, and he's very easy to get on with. John Leckie's like this sort of, he's great. I mean, he's also like an aging hippie. He's one of these people that you can't fail to like. And he did a brilliant job with the Stone Roses, if you're familiar with them. But he's not that good as a producer. He sort of lets you do what you want, which is why Andy likes him. you should really have a dictator like Todd, who I really admire. Lately, really weird things. I went to his house, a bit of name dropping here, but I went to his house last Saturday and he was playing sort of weird medieval music mixed with this weird improvised jazz. There was a movie out about, I can't remember what it was called, but there was this jazz festival. Do you remember? And it was filmed, and it was called something like A Lazy Sunday Afternoon, and he plays all that.
What does Colin play? What's he like?
Colin. At the moment he really likes a group called the Lars. Do you know the Lars? The Liverpool group. And Dave, I've never been to Dave's house, so I've never seen his record collection. They were the first band I ever saw live in a place called Barnstable. Barnstable's not much bigger than Princeton, and I saw them live in 1978. And my dad drove me the 30 miles from where we lived to Barnstable, even Barnstable in Devon, which is a rural part of England. And I was very naive. I got dropped off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and XTC were playing at Barnstable Checkers Club. And I noticed on my ticket it said doors open at 7:30. So I was first in the queue with my friend, and the queue was just me and my friend. And we got in, and by about 9 o'clock I was beginning to panic, because there didn't seem to be anyone else there. By about 9:30 it suddenly sort of filled in, the pub's emptied and everyone came in. By about 10 o'clock I walked up to the DJ and said, "So when are the band coming on?" And he said, "After the support band." I thought, oh shit. By about 11 o'clock XTC finally came on, and I'd never heard anything like them before in my life. It just very loud. By 11:30 my dad was honking the horn outside, so I had to go. But I do remember this naked lady dancing next to me during the set. So I was torn between naked lady on my right and XTC on the stage. And in 85, I sort of stayed in touch with the band, and in 85 I wrote to Andy and said, "Can I do a book on you?" And he rang up and laughed. And he rang up and laughed a couple of times. And then in 1990 I wrote to him again. I actually contacted a publisher in London and told them a big lie, that I'd been given the job of writing an official book on XTC. And they said, "Go ahead and do it." So I then had to tell the band that I was their official biographer. And it went from there. So it was all based on a big lie. The Americans here won't know this, but we've got an Australian soap opera called Neighbours. Do you? Ooh. It's like our third most popular programme on TV, and what was it that I heard? Wake Up. I heard that on Neighbours, and that gets like 17, 18 million viewers an episode, so there is one fan in Australia anyway. To me it was the most flattering thing that was said to me by the band from Andy was when he read the book back. He said, "I didn't know that they felt like that. I didn't know that Dave was pissed off that I didn't let him play enough on Black Sea or whatever." And so I found that quite extraordinary, that they were telling me things that they weren't even telling Andy. And the other good thing I thought was that, having told me the things that they didn't try and retract them. It sounds corny maybe, but it was just a pleasure to do, because whatever I wrote about them, no matter how horrendous or how embarrassing for them, they would never say, "Don't put that in," or "Please take that out." In fact, quite the opposite. Andy told me some stories that were so disgusting that I couldn't put them in. In fact, the editor at Omnibus Press said, "No, sorry, take them out." They were mainly sort of sexual related, and they were just in bad taste. I can tell you one, because that's not too bad. There's a guy in the book called Steve Warren. You know who he is? He was one of their roadies. Steve Warren, God, big bloke. One of their roadies up until about 1981. And Andy and Steve were best mates on the Penhill estate, which is like this horrible council estate in Swindon. And Steve shared a bedroom with his brother, who I think was called Dave. And one of Andy's most vivid childhood or adolescent recollections was going into Steve and Dave's bedroom, where his brother Dave had this stack of TV sets at the end of the bed, like 4 channels. In those days, we only had 4 channels in England, and they were all tuned to each one of the 4 channels individually, so that was very sophisticated. And one day he peeled back the curtains and showed Andy his used condom collection. And he was saying things like, "Here, Andy, look at this one here. That's Jackie. And see this one here? That's Heather. And this is Pam. See this one here? That's Sandra. I had her last night." So that's one of them, and they told me to take that out. Another one involved what Andy and his mates used to do into a biscuit tin in the shed. I can't tell you that. Just after Nonsuch came out, I really thought there was a big chance that they were going to do this MTV gig. Did you hear about that? Yeah. They were going to play in a tent, and there was going to be an audience of about 200 people. And it was going to be as live, and it was going to be recorded. And he was really excited about it. In fact, he told me that he spent a sleepless night thinking about what he was going to wear. So I thought, he's really serious about it this time. And at the last minute, he couldn't do it. And in fact, I spoke to Marianne, his wife, and he went through this whole thing of when Nonsuch came out, everybody wanted him to play live on their radio station and do this thing and that thing. And he chickened out of a very big promo thing in France because Nonsuch was happening there. And he chickened out. And he went back to see a homeopath, and they gave him arsenic tablets, which seemed to actually do the job. But no, I don't think so. I think it's too late now. I think it was Andy who told me this. Dave has mastered the art on living on £15 a week, which is less than $25. He never goes out. He eats a very strict vegetarian diet. He eats pulses and things. He doesn't buy anything except for guitars, which he saves up for months on end, which I find astonishing, and I'm sure you do too, because comparatively I live like a king. But Dave lives he doesn't have a mortgage on his house, so he owns his house, so he doesn't have those restrictions. He doesn't have a girlfriend. He really doesn't go out. Their lifestyles are so normal that they're probably very boring sounding, but an average day for Andy will be getting up when the kids wake him up. He'll walk Charlie, his dog, down the local park. He'll come back and he'll work with whoever he's working with, or whatever he's doing in his shed. And his wife will nag him about being a pain in the arse, and he'll nag Marianne about she spends too much money on their credit cards, and that's it. And he goes to the pub and he gets drunk on 4 pints. I see less of Colin because he's very quiet and he lives out in the country more, but he's very quiet, and he also spends a lot of time in his shed. Yeah, well, I got really annoyed when I was writing this book. I used to live in Exeter, which is a town in Devon, which is the West Country of England. And I spent 10 hours a day sitting at this desk in the public library, working. And one day somebody came up to me and said, "What are you doing? This is really intriguing us." And I told them, and they said, "XTC, I remember them making plans for Nigel." I went, "Oh, don't." That's how they're perceived in England. They're perceived as being this band that had hits 13 years ago. And even though they nearly had a hit last year, was it? Yeah, last year. Most people have never heard of them. I mean, we've skipped a generation now, so there's only a small percentage of people who've ever heard of them, and even those will go on, yeah, I used to love them. They'll always say, I used to love them, because they don't. That's the problem with not touring and not playing live. You become invisible, and people assume that you're not around anymore. I think they're really puzzled by it. I mean, I am too. I can't imagine why they're popular here. I know this is, you know, I mean, you're North Americans, and I'm sure you have friends who've never heard of them too. But in England, we now think of this as being their prime market, and if this went for them, they wouldn't be able to exist anymore, I don't think. And why that is, I mean, I can't imagine. But then again, I can't see. I mean, the Beatles were very English, and they went down well here. But you know, now Japan, they love XTC in Japan, and that's the weirdest one of all. No, all I can say is they must. Are they exotic, or you know? I mean, to me, they did what REM have been. You know, they did what REM are now doing years ago, and I could never understand them. They performed the same sort of idiosyncratic, clever pop that REM are doing, but they did it much better a decade ago, and I can't understand why they aren't as big as REM, save the fact that they don't play live. Well, I know that all their albums, all their last 3 albums have sold at least 500,000. Well, the Skylarking and Oranges and Lemons sold 500,000 just in the US, which may surprise you, but that was over quite a long period of time. And the current one, None Such, is now their best-selling album worldwide, and that's at about 600,000, 650,000. It doesn't sound a lot, but I mean, you know, there are a lot of new bands that are getting a lot of publicity right now that you might think of as being a big going concern, but they, you know, I think that's quite impressive. It keeps them in business. If they didn't, unfortunately, they sell that many. It's sort of like a halfway gap. It's not big enough to be really big, and it's not small enough to be dumped by the record company, because there's nothing Andy would like more than to be dumped by Virgin. Well, when I was interviewing him, he farted a lot. In fact, I had to leave the room a couple of times. In fact, he farted constantly. But he was one of these people that would tell you, "Ooh, I've just done a fart," and he'd waft it in your direction. Whenever I went down there, I was always on my own. And last week when I went down there, I went with a lady, and as soon as you know what he said earlier in that interview about women, he's the most outrageous flirt I've ever seen. As soon as a woman comes into the room, he just becomes Mr. Charming, and that's not an eccentricity, but he really is the slimiest little toad when a woman's around. Everything they do is done on a tiny budget. When Andy saw the first cover that they designed for the book, he said, "No, this is rubbish, and I want them to do it again, and if they don't do it again, I'm not going to let it be published." And he was throwing one of his tantrums, so I sort of yielded to that, and I rang up the publishers and said, "You've got to do another cover, otherwise it won't be published." And they said, "Well, that's going to cost us another £500. We're not sure if we can afford that." £500, for Christ's sake, is $750, and they weren't sure that they could afford that. We're talking, you know, tiny budgets. And I'm sure they owe me money, but they haven't paid me any yet. It's like that. It's really, it's all done very tight. I can't see them splitting up. I hope not.
Do you see Andy Partridge ever deciding to give up making albums? He gave up touring. Do you think he would ever decide to give up making albums?
No, never. He's got nothing else to do. You know, that's all he does. Unless, of course, Waddington's wanted to buy all his games, but he's already tried that and nobody wanted them, so... No, I can't. It's him, you know. There was this guy called Al Clark, who also features in the book very, very briefly. Al Clark was XTC's press officer for about, well, the bulk of the years that they were on the road, and he came up with the best quote that I didn't use in the book. That Andy has the imagination of 6 people. And that's it, you know, he has to tip it out somewhere. and he's always going to be recording. I mean, Books Are Burning, that was a song about Salman Rushdie. It had obviously things that bug him or, you know, annoy him in life. But he leads such an insular life, they all do. They just sit in their little homes in Swindon, and they hate it when they have to go up to London. And London's all of 70 miles away. We're not even talking about as far as Chicago here. And they hate it, they really do. I've seen them, when Oranges and Lemons came out, I saw them doing their promo interviews, and they all kind of shuffled in, and they looked really awkward, and none of them wanted to be there. They all wanted to be back home in their sheds. And the older they get, the more and more like that they become. That's what Marianne was complaining about bitterly when I was down there a couple of weeks ago. The fact that Andy never wants to go on holiday, and that he's a home bird, and he said, "What's wrong with that?" He talked about it for hours, yeah. I mean, there were loads of people that I'd never heard of. Hans Benink. Yes, he had. But I mean, there were all the obvious things. The biggest things were the Monkees, the Beatles, the Kinks, Pink Floyd, Small Faces, Beach Boys, and that's probably it. The big six. You know, sorry, Todd Rundgren. No, I've got to tell you about Todd Rundgren. I eventually got an interview with him on the phone, and I got given a phone number through his assistant, who I think was called Mary Jane. And somebody told me, if you phone up at this time, Todd will talk to you. And I thought, great. So I phoned at exactly that time, because I thought I'm not going to give him any excuse at all to turn me down. And I eventually got him. He took about 10 minutes to come to the phone. And it was like, "Hello, Todd?" "Yep." It's Chris Toomey. I'm writing a biography about XTC. "Oh yeah." It went on like that, and that lasted about 20 minutes. And at the end, there was nothing. I mean, if I played it, it would have been even more boring than Terry Chambers. And at the end, I said, "Thanks very much for talking to me anyway, Todd." "You bet. You wanker." That was it. I think it got off to a bad start, where apparently Andy was wearing a pair of very bad jeans. They were a bit baggy, and Todd pointed at them and said, "Where did you get those? God, they're terrible. They look like you bought them in Russia." And he just went on and on and on about Andy's jeans, to the point where Andy was embarrassed to be wearing these jeans. It just went on and on. It was like, it wasn't said affectionately, it was just said, you know, "Where the hell did you get those jeans?" And he was just sort of tormented Andy into the ground. And so apparently Andy left the studio that day and didn't come back. And it just went on like that. It was just like two people who sometimes you can imagine two extroverts getting on really well. On this occasion, they were just at each other's throats.